All right, everybody, we're back. Back for the attack. Frankenstein. It's about love, friendship, and horror. It's scary. Ready for chapter 7, the first murder. Hopefully you guys have been watching and keeping track because I've kind of forgotten where we've been, but I'm sure it'll come back to me. One warm May morning, Henry and I had just returned from an invigorating, glorious walk in the countryside, when a letter from my father was delivered to me. I'd been expecting it, for I was planning to visit my family in Geneva after my 2 years away. I opened it eagerly and read, "My dear son, it is with sadness and tears that I call you back home. But first, I must prepare you for some terrible news before your arrival. Your darling little brother William is dead. That gentle, innocent child has been murdered." Wow, this is getting good. "I will not try to console you, but I will simply tell you what happened as we know it. Last Thursday evening, Elizabeth, your 2 brothers, and I went for a walk in the woods. At the park where you loved to run and play as a child. William and Ernest had been running ahead of us, playing hide and seek. When it started getting dark, Elizabeth and I sat down on a bench to wait for the boys. In a while, Ernest returned, asking if we'd seen William, who had gone to hide but had not returned. We jumped up and immediately began to search. By nightfall, we hadn't found him, and Elizabeth returned home to alert our neighbors and get some torches to continue our search for William. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I made the gruesome discovery. I found William's cold, lifeless body in the grass, with the murderer's fingerprints still on his throat. This is getting awesome. I tearfully carried him home and laid him on his bed. When Elizabeth bent over his lifeless body and saw his neck, she cried out, 'Oh God, I have murdered my darling child,' and she fainted in my arms. When we revived her, she tearfully explained that earlier that day, William had begged to be allowed to wear her chain and locket, the one that belongs to your dear dead mother and contained her picture. Elizabeth loved William so much, she couldn't refuse him anything. When she discovered the locket missing from his neck, she assumed the robbery was the reason for the murder. We have no trace of the murderer as of yet. Elizabeth cannot stop crying and blames herself for William's death. We need you here, Victor, not to avenge the murder, but to help us heal our grieving hearts. Your loving father, Alfonso Frankenstein." I threw the letter on the table, covered my face with my hands, and began to cry uncontrollably. Henry put his arm around my shoulders and asked, "My dear friend, what's wrong? What has happened to make you cry so bitterly?" I couldn't speak and was barely able to catch my breath. In between sobs, I managed to point to the letter on the table. Henry picked it up and began to read. He gasped, then tears gushed from his eyes as he too read the terrible news. Chapter 8, Sighting the Monster. I hired a horse and carriage and left immediately for Geneva. It was a sad journey, with my thoughts full of memories of my sweet, innocent brother and the horror my grieving family were all suffering. As night came and I approached Geneva, gloom and fear replaced my sadness. It was after 10 o'clock when I drove up to the gates of the city. In my grief, I'd forgotten that the gates closed at 10. Since I couldn't enter the city until the next morning, I rented a room for the night at an inn in a nearby village on Lake Geneva. I was too nervous to sleep, so I decided to rent a boat and sail across the lake. The woods were on the other side, and I somehow needed to see the place where my brother was murdered. A lightning storm was approaching over the mountains, and by the time I reached the shore, a heavy rain had begun to fall. Thunder burst with a deafening crash, and eerie flashes of lightning lit up the lake as if it were on fire. No sooner had I pulled my boat up on the shore than I caught a sight of a figure on a gloomy mountainside. As the figure moved out from behind a thick clump of trees, I froze in my tracks and stared into the darkness. The next flash of lightning lit up the figure. It was gigantic, hideous, and its shape only confirmed my biggest fears. It was the monster. What was he doing here after all this time? Then I shuddered at another thought. I asked myself, could he have anything to do with my brother's murder? No sooner did that question occur to me than I knew the answer. Yes, I knew for certain that only such a horrible monster could murder an innocent child. My teeth began to chatter and my knees went weak. I leaned against a tree to keep from falling. A moment later, when I looked up, I saw the figure running away. I started to follow him, but the next flash of lightning showed him climbing the steep rocks on the side of the mountain. Then he was gone, disappearing over the top. I stood frozen against the tree, thinking back to the night 2 years ago when I'd given life to this creature. I was filled with guilt as I now asked myself, did I turn a monster loose in the world so that he could kill? And what other terrible crimes has he committed? I spent the night cold and wet on that hillside, agonizing on the horror I had created. When day dawned, I made my way to Geneva and my father's house. I considered alerting the police so that the monster could be tracked down. But what kind of story could I tell? Could I say that I, a university student, had created a monster and given life to it 2 years ago, then had seen that very monster on the side of the mountain just last night? Besides, who would believe such a strange tale from the lips of a man who'd spent so many months with a fever that was close to madness? I knew that if someone came to me with such a story, I would say it was the ravings of a madman. Besides, what human could hope to stop or even catch a creature who was capable of climbing the sides of a mountain as the monster had done? I had no answers, so I decided to remain silent. That's the end of chapter 8. Stay tuned for chapter 9 and 10.